Hello and good afternoon. For the next several sessions, we're going to study and discuss Plenty Coup, Chief Plenty Coups' lament that when the buffalo went away, the hearts of my people fell to the ground, and they could not lift them up again. After this, there was nothing. This presentation was initially developed for a live class with the possibilities for us to interact with each other around the topics that will be presented. But now, as it is unwise for us to gather together in numbers, and we don't truthfully know exactly when the time will be when we can gather again, we decided to film these and make them available to you for your use whenever you might like to watch or listen to them. And while I would certainly most rather be in your presence live, I hope that the materials presented will be in a manner that is clear and understandable. I have several caveats that I will mention shortly, but for now, know that I do not consider being an educator amongst my gifts. As I listened to Tobin share a couple of weeks ago during our Lenten classes, I only wish that I had a third of his ability to teach and to convey thoughts. I'm going to provide this class in approximately 30-minute sessions. If technology allows, there is a documentary film that I would like for everyone to see. There may or may not be a link available for you, but if there is no link, you can go to YouTube, type in your search for Buffalo Unity Project, and the film will be there. If questions arise, please email me at gahtrek@bresnan.net or text me the questions at 239-7346. I will use the first 10 or 15 minutes of subsequent classes, hopefully to address any questions that you might have. But first things first, when I first returned to graduate school in 2000 to begin studying another field of interest, there were several of us, my classmates, who made various presentations at philosophical and ethics conferences. And we decided that before each one of our lectures or presentations, we would ask the audience 3 questions. They were each one developed by us. Each one of us developed at least one question. And we felt that they should be common knowledge. And as you will see, the questions represent our geographical beginnings. They may represent our professions or our general state of knowledge. We, of course, would not ask a question for which we did not have an answer. And the 3 questions always, and these are the first ones for you today: who invented the cotton gin? And secondly, name the Great Lakes. And thirdly, what are the non-technical names for the 3 small bones in the middle ear? You will be tested on these later. And now for some more formal caveats. I am not a theologian. I am not Native American. I do not pretend to speak for Native Americans. I did work on all the reservations in Montana and Wyoming as an audiologist for 23 years with Indian Health Service, but that does not make me an expert in their culture or their spirituality, or for that matter, anyone's spirituality. I am leaning heavily on a book, Radical Hope, Ethics in the Face of Cultural Devastation, written by Jonathan Lear for this presentation. The basic outline will be a lecture reflecting some aspects of the Buffalo, Coup sticks, and Count Coup that were an important part of the Crow culture. That information will be followed by sessions to include the documentary film festival, or documentary film on the Buffalo and one tribe's attempt to resurrect and instruct its cultural importance to the next generation. We'll also discuss Plenty Coups' vision and dream quest. And finally, during the later sessions, we will discuss what aspects of our culture are important and how would we react if those important aspects were no longer available to us. I'd like to give you some background on how I came to read this book and to study this particular area of interest. In 2000, I came to Missoula to study at the university in the field of ethics. I was also working at the Rocky Mountain Ear, Nose, and Throat as an audiologist, and Rocky Mountain was the only cochlear implant center in the state. And cochlear implants are a surgically implanted device that provides hearing for the deaf. And one of the ethical dilemmas is to be most effective, you implant it before a child is of 3 years of age. So suddenly, my study in two rather diverse fields crossed paths. As I began to read about culture and identity, specifically the culture of the deaf, I was at an ethical crossroad. My profession as an audiologist was intent on viewing deafness from a medical point of view, thus the need to alleviate the loss of one of our senses. But my study of ethics, which valued consent, justice, cultural identity, introduced me to the concept of a deaf culture and the claim from the deaf culture that by implanting a hearing device into deaf-born infants and children, and you had to do this without their consent, I was an accomplice to ethnocide, the destruction of the deaf culture. And that claim, if you accept that there is a deaf culture, is true. 90% of all deaf children are born to hearing parents. And if we implant all of those children, then there will be no deaf adults, thus no deaf culture in the future. And as we speak, in 50 to 60 years, there will most likely not be a deaf culture. There will be no schools for the deaf, few if any deaf organizations, and even Gallaudet University, which is the primary higher educational institution for the deaf, may cease to exist as it presently does, because there will be too few congenitally deaf adults to maintain a culture. And in my study of cultural demise and destruction, I came across this book, Radical Hope, Ethics in the Face of Cultural Devastation. And in Episcopal terms, it added the third leg of my stool. I had my profession as an audiologist involved with hearing. I was studying ethics and cultural identity. And then the third leg was my interest and experience with Native Americans. And now as I stand or sit before you, I am an expert in nothing, excluding my ability to expound on the difficulties of learning to play the harmonica or the absolute perfection of the bicycle as a mechanical machine. But I come wondering with you, how do we cope, and not just cope, and not just survive, but flourish at a time when many of us may be anxious about the future for us and for our grandchildren. We are anxious because of the environmental changes and extreme natural disasters we read and hear about daily. We are anxious right now because there appears to be a nearly worldwide pandemic of a virus that changes everything about how we exist today. It changes our economy. It changes about how we view each other. It changes our work and recreation, and it changes how we congregate communally. We are anxious because we have lost confidence in many of the institutions that have until now been foundational to our comfort. Our government, the concepts of honesty and truthfulness. Some of our churches and organizations such as the Boy Scouts, as they deal with the widespread accusation of child abuse. We don't understand Bitcoins, the instantaneous nature of social media. We don't understand the threat of North Korea, and the list could go on and on. But I trust in the wisdom of this group to gather from this study of how Plenty Coup helped his people survive and to flourish in spite of the cultural devastation that he and the Crow people experienced, to develop a way forward, which I personally believe, as spiritual people, we are well equipped to do. So let us start this journey with Plenty Coup. Shortly before he died, Plenty Coup, the last great chief of the Crow Nation, shared his story with the writer Frank Lindeman. And Plenty Coup tells Lindeman, "I am glad I have told you these things, sign talker. You have felt my heart, and I have felt yours. I know you will tell only what I have said, that your writing will be straight like your tongue, and I will sign your papers with my thumb, so that your people and mine will know I told you the things you have written down." What Plenty Coup shared was the account of a young man growing up when the Crow tribe was still a vibrant tribe of nomadic hunters. Their culture and way of life depended on preparing for the hunt itself, and then a celebration of all the gifts the buffalo would bring to them. But what is missing from his discussion with Lindeman, what Plenty Coup does not discuss, is what happened after the Crow were confined to a reservation. Lindeman writes, Plenty Coup refused to speak of his life after the passing of the buffalo, so that his story seems to have been broken off, leaving many years unaccounted for. Plenty Coup says, "I have told you half of what happened when I was young. I can think back and tell you much more of war and horse stealing. But when the buffalo went away, the hearts of my people fell to the ground, and they could not lift them up again. After this, nothing happened. There was little singing anywhere." There is, of course, a natural inclination to assign a psychological explanation to these devastating words. That after the buffalo went away, after they were confined to a reservation, the Crow people became depressed. Things ceased to matter to them. A general malaise came over them. This interpretation fits with what philosophers call the principle of humanity, that we should try to interpret others as saying something true, guided by our own sense of what is true and what they could reasonably believe. And depression and malaise are reasonable beliefs in light of this devastation. But what if, rather than Plenty Coup making a statement about the Crow, he was making a claim about the world, that after a certain point, nothing happened anywhere? Might he not be giving utterance to a darker thought, one that is more difficult for us to understand? That the psychological explanation is too thin, that it does not give credence to what was lost spiritually. What happened when a way of life is no longer available? Surely the response has greater impact than to just say, They were saddened and depressed. Lindemann contends that Plenty Coups' remark is enigmatic, in part because it is compatible with so many different interpretations, ranging from an old chief nostalgic for a bygone era, to others that involve delving to the heart of actually the human condition. But this particular destruction of Crow culture that Lindemann and Plenty Coups express seem to transcend human vulnerability. The breakdown that we all experience from age, from disease, from insults from our environment. As human beings, as participants in a certain way of life, we do inherit a vulnerability, but that is personal. It is our problem. How we deal with disease, poverty, malaise, aging, dying, that is more of a personal dilemma. But what would happen if collectively our way of life collapsed? Would we not experience that vulnerability at a deeper, more profound level? We inhabit, you and I, a way of life that is expressed in a culture. And if we were together live, I would ask you, what are some of these ways of our life? What makes up our culture? What if there was no need for a work ethic or an education? What if we lost the need to congregate or to communicate? What if we lost our sun or its rays were muted? What would this mean? Lindemann points out in his book that he is not concerned with what actually happened to the Crow people or any other group facing cultural devastation, but rather with all the possibilities in which human endeavors gain meaning. How do we strive? How do we flourish when we share a common vulnerability that exists simply by virtue of our being human? Not you human, not you human, not me human, but a global us human. The Crow did endure a cultural catastrophe, and it may be helpful to learn from their experience and how they found a meaningful way forward. But to learn from their experience, we must understand something about their way of life and the absolute importance of the buffalo and a warrior life to that way of life. Joe Medicine Crow, a crow, an elder, a historian, and I think the first Native American law graduate in the nation, describes the Crow as a nomadic, hunting, warrior tribe. As a nomadic tribe, they had to be good hunters, and they had to be good at protecting themselves against rival tribes, the Sioux, the Blackfeet, and the Cheyenne. Fighting battles, defending their territory, preparing to go to war, hunting the buffalo, all of this permeated the Crow way of life. And please understand, it was not just the male Crow way of life. I'm going to read you a section of the book here. War was not the concern of a class, nor even of the male sex, but of the whole population. From cradle to grave, girls as well as boys derived their names from a famous man's exploit. Women danced wearing scalps, derived honor from their husbands' deeds, publicly exhibited the man's shields or weapons, and a woman's lamentations over a slain son was the most effective goad to a punitive expedition. The planting of a coup stick and counting coup were two features of the Crow warfare. Each clan of the tribe had its own coup stick, and the head of the war party of that clan would carry the coup stick into battle. A fundamental principle of warrior honor was if in battle a warrior struck his coup stick in the ground. He must not retreat. He must not leave the stick. He must hold his ground or die losing his coup stick to the enemy. The planting of the coup stick was a way of saying to the enemy, beyond this point, penetration by a non-Crow enemy is impossible. To Count Coup, the second feature of a Crow warfare is described as follows. To Count Coup, a warrior had to strike an armed and fighting enemy with his coup stick, but before otherwise harming him, or to take his weapon while he was yet alive, or to strike the enemy's breastplate, harming him, or take his weapons while he was yet alive, or to strike the enemy's breastplate, or to steal a horse tied to the edge of an enemy's camp. To strike such a coup, a warrior would be displaying great courage and great bravery. Obviously, counting coup valorized bravery and courage, traits that were necessary for the Crow to survive. Life was organized around this kind of bravery. But as times, battles, losses, the extinction of the buffalo go on, in 1921, Plenty Coup recognizes that there is now no way that a coup stick can function where there is no war and there are no buffalo. At the tomb of the unknown soldier in Washington, D.C., Plenty Coup is there to represent the Indian nations. And after the chaplain had completed his prayers, Plenty Coup stepped forward. He was dressed in brilliantly beaded buckskin, carrying a coup stick and wearing an eagle feather headdress. The 72-year-old warrior's presence was stunning. It was a stunning match for the European generals and for the officers from Mikado's navy who stood in the front ranks, and the huge crowd watched in absolute silence as the leader of the Crow Nation removed his war bonnet and laid it on the sarcophagus alongside his coup stick. What was Plenty Coup doing? These were items that defined the essence of life for the Crow people. They represented the hunter-warrior nation. While there may be many meanings attached to Plenty Coup's action, in the context of our discussion here today about the destruction of a culture, it is understood that he was bearing these markings of a life no longer available to the Crow, that he was serving as a remarkable kind of witness. He was marking the end of a way of life in which the coup stick and the war bonnet had integral roles. He is witnessing to the end of their traditional days. And let's be clear, this is not just a dramatic gesture. During the period of vibrant nomadic life, everything was somehow related to hunting and war. All the rituals, all the customs, all the distribution of honor, all the day-to-day preparations, all the upbringing of the Crow children were organized towards these ends. The flourishing life of the Crow was one of unfettered hunting of beaver and buffalo. It occurred in a land that they understood to be given them by God. Battle was a means of protecting this God-given land and this way of life. As an example of the cascading effects of the collapse of the culture and way of life, take the Sundance. It is a prayer-filled ritual asking God's help in winning a military victory. But now that there is no war to fight, What is one to do with the Sundance? What is its purpose? The Crow were left with three choices. One, to keep dancing even if eventually no one can remember why they are dancing. Two, to invent a new meaning for the dance, to pray for good weather, wellness of a tribal member, etc. Or three, give up the dance, as there is no longer any point in dancing the Sundance. Think of an activity in your life that is sacred. How would you respond if it suddenly, for whatever reason, became useless? Think about a sacred aspect of our religion. What if communion was no longer meaningful? What would we do? On a more trivial note, what if sports no longer had meaning, no longer brought joy to people's lives? You would go to Ogren Field to watch a baseball game, and as you're buying the ticket, they tell you, sorry, the last baseball game ever to be played was played yesterday. The Crow gave up on the dance around 1875. It was not until 1941 that the Crow wanted to reintroduce the Sundance. But no living Crow remembered the steps. So they went to their traditional enemy, the Shoshone in Wyoming, to relearn the steps. To continue the analogies that I mentioned earlier, we bring back sports, but we no longer know what to do when we watch. Or we can drink from the chalice and we can take the host, but no one amongst us knows why we do it. They become empty, meaningless, rote activities that bring no flourishing to our lives. And make no mistake about this, prior to the loss of the buffalo, the Crow had a conception, a deep conception of happiness, a conception of what life was worth living for. They lived in relationship to a spiritual world in which they believed God had chosen them for this certain kind of life. Happiness consisted in living that life to the fullest. This was an active and unfettered pursuit of a nomadic hunting life in which their family life and social rituals could prosper. When the buffalo were gone and the warrior life no longer existed, that which had given the telos, or the goal of that life, disappeared. Their problem was not simply that they could not pursue happiness in their traditional ways. Rather, their conception of what happiness is could no longer be lived. The characteristic activities that used to constitute the good life ceased to be intelligible acts. A number of tribal leaders voiced this loss. A Crow medicine woman, Pretty Shield, tells Lindemann, I am trying to live a life that I do not understand. Two Leggings, a lesser Crow, says, nothing happened after that. We just lived. There were no more war parties, no capturing of horses, no buffalo to hunt. People continued to prepare meals, but now it was only cooking in order to survive. The people continued to act practically, but they had lost the rich framework in which such acts as cooking made sense. Agnes Yellowtail Deernose speaks of that time with a story from the woman's perspective, because they too were faced and confronted with the destruction of their way of living and being. She says, we talked to our children, told them things they needed to know, but we never struck a child, never. Lately, however, I did strike a child. There seemed to be nothing else to do. Times and children have changed so. One of my granddaughters ran off to a dance with a bad young man. After I told her she must not go, I went after her. It was a long way too, but I got her, and in time. I brought her home to my place and used a saddle strap on her. I struck her, sign talker. I hope it helped her, and yet I felt ashamed of striking my grandchild. It was then that she supported what Pretty Shield had said. I am trying to live a life that I do not understand. Certainly for the Crow, there remained ways to live, example like the white man lived. But these were not the categories in which Plenty Coup would have chosen to live his life, or the life for his Crow people. And yet, that kind of life, the circumstances in which Plenty Coup was called upon to act, were exactly like that. Do we follow and live in the ways of the white man? How could they go on living a life as they previously understood it? The virtue, courage, how would they use it? Not backing away from the coup stick, but how would they use it to face these new circumstances and draw upon their traditions in novel ways in the face of these novel challenges that had become necessary? Their way of life, a life they believed that had been given to them by God, and yet an essence of the Crow Nation and of Plenty Coup's wisdom was not to forsake God. It was not to blame God for the loss of their life. Rather, it was Plenty Coup who recounted his dream, his message from the chickadee. It was these spiritual acts that guided Plenty Coup and the Crow Nation out of this abyss toward a new definition of a life well lived. Thank you for your attention. Remember, if you have questions, please text them to me at 239-7346 or email me at gahtrek@bresnan.net. During the next session, we will spend more time, in fact, considerable time, with Plenty Coup's dream and with the message that he receives from the chickadee about how to move forward in this new life. Thank you.